the internet and democracy. How new are the debates? Last week, on Thursday, the 17th of March 2022, the UK government finally introduced the Online Safety Bill into Parliament. It followed a protracted period of external pressure and consultation. The bill, as its explanatory notes put it, quote, establishes a new regulatory regime to address illegal and harmful content online, end quote. It seeks to balance the protection of internet users with the protection of freedom of expression and the maintenance of the social benefits of the internet. The development and introduction of the bill have reflected a trend in public perception of the internet that's built up in particular since events such as the election of Donald Trump as US president and the European Union referendum in the UK of both of 2016. Scrutiny of such events and how they came to pass helped contribute to a growing sense that the internet was a source of malign outcomes on an international scale. In these kind of accounts of the internet, the technology is often depicted as connected to threats to democracy. Concerns raised in this regard, and really these are an interconnected set of concerns, included that the internet was a source of false information and undermined standards of reliable professional journalism, that it promoted extremism and division in politics, that it was a threat to personal privacy, that it facilitated oppressive activity by governments directed towards their own populations, that it enabled interference in electoral and other political processes, including by foreign powers that were inimical to democracy and by other hostile non-state actors, that the internet afforded excessive resources and power to unaccountable monopolistic international corporations, and that it exposed those seeking to participate in politics to abuse, and that finally it was a medium for the targeting of vulnerable groups. This narrative regarding the internet and particular applications of it, such as social media, has to some extent supplanted a more positive interpretation of the technology which previously prevailed. According to this once more pervasive school of thought, the internet is potentially beneficial to democracy and through on a number of bases, including its ability to provide wider public access to information, enhance freedom of expression, expanding the range of opinions and voices given exposure, enabling the public to become creators of content rather than simply passive recipients, in the process breaking down the barrier between providers of content and audience, allowing for wider public participation in meaningful political debate, facilitating two-way communication between public on the one hand and those who govern them on the other. In some accounts, potentially allowing for more direct forms of democracy, perhaps bypassing mediating representative institutions, if one regards that kind of activity as a desirable thing, which is another debate. Making campaigning and spontaneous formation of political groupings easier, lowering the startup cost of people getting together politically, and providing marginalised groups with access to political processes. We can see then that there are some contrasting perspectives on the internet, and as I'm going to go on to discuss, they're in fact manifestations of a pattern in the analysis of communications technology that long predates the internet itself coming into being and becoming the predominant, arguably, form of mass communication in the world. This time I'm going to talk mainly about trends that predated the Second World War. I picked the Second World War as a broad cut-off point because it's interesting from a technological point of view in that it gave a lot of impetus to developments that led to the internet, for instance, through accelerating the development of computer technology and also of rocket technology, which led to the possibility of actually putting satellites into orbit. So those kind of technological developments which were accelerated by the Second World War, eventually led on to the internet as we know it today. So I'm going to look at before that conflict broke out, mainly in the discussion that follows. And I'm going to come back to more recent tendencies in another talk at another time. When we look at these long-run tendencies in discussion of communications technology, many discussions of inventions in this field, the future path they might take and their implications, have presented positive views. There's a general idea of science being central to human advancement. It was certainly a feature of the broad intellectual movement that we now know as the Enlightenment, which is associated often with the 18th century. Within this school, for instance, the economist Adam Smith attached significance to inventions as being key to economic expansion. Moving on a bit further in the 18th century, among those on whom the French Revolution had an impact, in a 1792 work called A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, Mary Wollstonecraft, regarded as a pioneer of feminist thought, stressed the importance of scientific education of women and men alike. In the following century, political thinkers like Marx saw technological change, though brutal in its impact, as driving historical development. Communications technology in particular has often been presented as a positive force, potentially beneficial to democracy. For instance, during the 19th century, some saw the telegraph, the invention of the telegraph, in this light. In 1871, the American poet James Russell Lowell held that, quote, the newspapers and telegraph gather the whole nation into a vast town meeting, close quote. In the field of speculative fiction, in a work first serialized in 1880-81, Mary Bradley depicted in Mizora, a Prophecy, an all-female society living inside the earth. An aspect of the perfection of the polity that Bradley depicted was its use of advanced technology. Among, as Bradley put it, the wonders those people produce with electricity, close quote, that Bradley describes, are devices for mass and individual audiovisual communication. Bradley describes how, quote, the person who desired to converse with another, no matter how far distant, placed herself in communication with her two instruments and signalled. Her friend appeared upon the polished metal surface like the figure in a mirror and spoke to her audibly and looked at her with all the naturalness of reality. Bradley was an early example of an author of speculative fiction who to some extent anticipated technology that looks a bit like the internet as we understand it today, and placed it in a socio-political context, saying it was a feature of a perfect society as envisaged. Many other authors in this vein would follow. Bradley's just one example and an interesting early example. Alongside these speculations about technology, there were real-world technological developments that required responses. If we look at the first Committee on Broadcasting in the UK, which reported in 1923, we can see it arguing that, quote, the outstanding feature of radio telephony is that it enables a single voice to reach innumerable ears. It can carry speech and melody into every home. It can bring isolated towns and villages into close touch with the great centres of population, close quote. The report, in fact, went as far as to hold, quote, it may be that broadcasting holds social and political possibilities as great as any technical attainment of our generation, close quote. Excitement about the possibilities for the radio continued. In 1932, for instance, the German playwright Bertolt Brecht published an essay entitled The Radio as an Apparatus of Communication. Brecht looked forward to a time in which radio would become able to, quote, receive as well as to transmit, to let the listener speak as well as hear, to bring him into a relationship instead of isolating him, close quote. Brecht held that the radio should, quote, step out of the supply business and organise its listeners as suppliers, close quote. A parallel development to radio, film, was also regarded as important. In a work that appeared in 1923 entitled That Marvel, the Movie, Edward S. Van Zyl argued that film, which at that time existed in what we would now describe as its silent form, could, if approached properly, be a force to enable humanity to unify and to overcome what he called the four horsemen of the apocalypse: war, famine, poverty and disease. So we can see there grandiose ideas for what could be achieved by film. We can also see this kind of excitement around television. In a 1932 work, The Outlook for Television, Orrin E. Dunlap asserted that, quote, "The world is on the threshold of a great forward movement in mass communication, transmission and repetition of sound and sight combined." Dunlap held that television would, quote, "enable a large part of the Earth's inhabitants to see and hear one another without leaving their homes." Dunlap described television as, quote, "an easy, quick and economical means of spreading knowledge and information." For Dunlap, ultimately television would, quote, "bring nations face to face," and was a new weapon against hatred and fear, suspicion and hostility. 4 decades later, similarly optimistic claims were being made about the potential of cable television and then network computers, the dominant device for achieving which became, by the 1990s, the internet. So we can see long precursors to this more optimistic school of thought around the internet and devices such as social media. These authors and publications, though they might acknowledge some drawbacks, were generally excited about the perceived benefits, potential or actual, of advances in communications technology. But there's also been ongoing observation of a darker side to such inventions. When we think about views of technology and science that come out of the 18th century and into the 19th century, it's useful to look at the work of Mary Shelley, daughter of Wollstonecraft, who we heard about earlier, who published the first edition of Frankenstein in 1818. It's difficult to overstate the influence of this work, and we can see it as depicting the possibility for science to have destructive consequences. Alongside Shelley, there were other exponents of the Romantic artistic school, such as William Blake and William Wordsworth, who interpreted as reacting negatively to technological developments and the industrialization process of their era. As the 19th century continued, bleak depictions of this socio-economic transition continued, for instance in Shirley, a novel by Charlotte Bronte. It appeared in 1849 and was set around 1811-12 at the time of the Luddite disturbances. It gave an account of unemployed workers who hated the machines which they believed took their bread from them, hated the buildings which contained those machines, hated the manufacturers who owned those buildings. End of that quote. If we focus specifically on communications technology, Marx, who, as we've seen, felt that technology was an agent of history, nonetheless anticipated what we might call the fake news concept of the 21st century. Marx detected conflicting media accounts of the Vienna uprising that commenced in October 1848 and speculated about the dissemination of what he described as false rumours, which Marx held were in some of the press at the time, and speculated also about the part that the state telegraph, as he described it, might have played in them. Marx portrayed premature claims regarding the surrender of Vienna as a consequence of a false telegram, the term he used, that was, open quote, deliberately or as a result of a misunderstanding issued to the world, close quote. Compliant journals had, Marx held, open quote, like an orthodox multilingual echo, willingly repeated the message, close quote. So we find this idea of the generation of false information using this new technology, then being spread sometimes deliberately, what we might call disinformation, sometimes unknowingly, what we might call misinformation. So very much anticipating the idea of there being a connection between developments in communication technology and the spreading of what's known now colloquially as fake news. We saw how speculative or science fiction has managed to present a positive view of technology and seeing communications technology, advanced communications technology, as potentially being a part of a perfect society. But this kind of fiction has also promoted more negative perceptions of communications technology. For instance, E.M. Forster first published the short story The Machine Stops in 1909. In this work, Forster depicts a future Earth in which members of a population who dwell underground in automated homes have little physical contact with one another. The machine of the title is a system made by humans on which they have become dependent. It is in part a communications network that enables people to order products such as clothes and food and transmitting music to them on request. It provides for remote audio-visual contact using handheld devices. The population have settled for convenience over quality of life in an oppressively conformist and authoritarian society. Forster is one fairly early example of this negative view of the potential of communications technology, and going slightly beyond the period of what I'm talking about today, we can see the most perhaps celebrated and influential example of this kind of view of technology occurring in the 1949 George Orwell novel 1984. In the opening pages of 1984, Orwell introduces the reader to the telescreen, as he called it, described as an oblong metal plaque like a dulled mirror which is built into wall. These communications devices enable the dissemination of official announcements and the surveillance of the population. Orwell explains that the telescreen, quote, could be dimmed, but there was no way of shutting it off completely. Orwell goes on to describe how, quote, the telescreen received and transmitted simultaneously. Any sound made above the level of a whisper would be picked up by it. There was no way of knowing whether you were being watched at any given moment. You had to live from habit that became instinct, in the assumption that every sound you made was overheard, and except in darkness, every movement scrutinised, end quote. We can see here that the idea of two-way communication that Brecht was excited about was for Orwell a very negative thing. And we can see in both accounts, on the one hand, in Brecht's view of what could be done with the radio, some of the positive views of the internet, and then in Orwell's negative outlook, some of the far more pessimistic views of what might happen with communications technology in some kind of society that they both envisaged. So long before the internet, these optimistic and pessimistic narratives that surround it today, including in its political implications, were already firmly established. But beyond that, there are attempts to recognise that both positions had some validity, but also to transcend the tension between them, creating a more nuanced approach to inventions and their social role. Francis Bacon's unfinished work, A New Atlantis, was published after his death in 1626. It depicted an imaginary, isolated and scientifically advanced island society. This essay is noted for the prescience it displayed. Bacon described, for instance, flying machines, submarines vessels, towers up to 1/2 mile in height, the creation of new breeds of plants and animal life, and means of modifying the temperature. There were what he called perspective houses for the display of various simulated images. Bacon also described what he called houses of deceits of the senses. Within these buildings, it was possible to represent all manner of feats of juggling, false apparitions, impostures and illusions. Close quote. Given the ingenuity on display, the science of the island, as Bacon put it, could easily have gone far in creating the means to, in his words, deceive the senses, close quote. However, there's an organisation called Salomon's House which acts as a kind of scientific guild, and it's firmly opposed to what Bacon calls all impostures and lies, and it plays the role of regulating technology, making sure that inventions which might be problematic aren't made available to the public, and in some cases are even withheld from the governmental authorities. So we can see this idea that technology can be very good, can be very bad, but there's a need for regulation, there's a need for bodies to take a role in ensuring that the benefits of technology are yielded and the potential damage is prevented. During the 19th century, socialist thinkers in the UK, such as Robert Owen and later William Morris, took this kind of a more sophisticated view towards technology. They regarded it, in its then contemporary application, as hugely detrimental to the quality of life of much of the population, though at the same time beneficial to the privileged few. Both Owen and later Morris advocated a social system in which the application of technology was regulated in such a way that its potentially immense social benefits could be yielded for the wider good. A persistent contributor to the genre of novels about scientifically advanced societies that we've already heard about was H.G. Wells. While broadly regarded as a technological enthusiast, at times Wells also conveyed a more cautionary note. His work, Men Like Gods, for instance, appeared in 1923. Wells depicted, once again, a planet called Utopia that was, as the name would suggest, a perfect society. However, he also recorded that before arriving at a condition of egalitarian paradise, the range of devices and techniques that facilitated the society had originally brought about immense and destructive social destabilization. In this society that was eventually established out of all this chaos and destruction, various advanced inventions did still play a significant role. Of interest for what we're talking about today, Wells described a mobile device that comprised, as he put it, quote, a little bundle of wires and light rods that connected to a pillar, providing the utopian equivalent of letter and telephone. Messages, close quote, messages sent on this network are stored in a way that a user can access them at a point convenient to them, playing them repeatedly if necessary, and also issue replies or new communications in the same form of communication, of transmission. Telephone conversations as such are not a normal occurrence. Wells notes, quote, the transmission is wireless, close quote. The storage stations for messages have only minimal personnel, with most of the connections, as Wells put it, automatic. Finally, Wells describes communications as how communications, quote, came and went from any part of the planet, close quote. So it's a global wireless communications network that people can use at their own convenience in a way that suits them. So, again, we find an interesting anticipation. I'm not saying he wholly predicted the internet, but there's an interesting description of a technology here. And then, as we'll see, Wells goes on to discuss its implications and the way of yielding the benefits and dealing with the problems. So Wells then discusses the political ramifications of this network. He notes that the organisation responsible for communications, quote, had a complete knowledge of the whereabouts of every soul upon the planet. It had a record of every living person, and it knew in what message district he was. Everyone was indexed and noted, close quote. Such data in the possession of, quote, earthly governments could lead to unending blackmail and tyranny, as Wells put it, leaving everybody, again as he puts it, open to espionage, close quote. Abuse of this kind was prevented on Utopia by adherence to what Wells calls 5 principles of liberty. First was that of privacy of personal information. Second was freedom of movement. Third was unlimited knowledge, which meant that all information that existed, except of a personal nature, was readily accessible to everybody. The fourth rule was that as well as being available, information should be free from misrepresentation. The fifth principle was what Wells called free discussion and criticism. So how to reconcile the fourth rule of information being kept free from misrepresentation while also allowing free discussion and criticism? Wells suggested a system in which there was an agreed body of facts upon which it would then be possible to place differing interpretations. It is achieved through Utopia, making, as Wells puts it, a complete distinction between news and discussion, close quote. People were entitled to express their views, however subversive, as Wells put it, in any form that suited them, and had access to means of mass distribution of their output. They were subject to only one limitation, that they, again in the words of Wells, refrain from lying, close quote. The challenges Wells identified were influenced by the contemporary concerns of his time and projected onto the alternative world he constructed. These perceived problems and the solutions he proposed show that the motivation for and objectives of the Online Safety Bill have clear precursors. Coming debates over this legislation as it passes through Parliament will probably partly comprise a rehearsal of earlier discussions that I've already talked about. A goal such as achieving a clearer distinction between fact and opinion in public discourse is certainly salient today. It might be an ambitious one, but it's perhaps a worthwhile objective for policymakers. A way forward could be through enhanced resources and protection for the impartiality of public service media. But whether this is a task the present government wishes to undertake is less than certain.